Hello. Welcome to Grow Yourself from the Inside Out. So nice to be with you again today. Thank you for joining us for those who are here. And of course, if you are watching this, later on after it becomes a recording or it turns into a podcast. Now, I should say this. I believe I said it last time that we have officially are repurposing this particular live stream into a podcast. So you can find it all over the place, including Spotify, just a whole host of them. But and I'll make sure that we put a link about that. So, many don't have the opportunity to really stop and watch, and there are many who, like myself, when I'm outside mowing the grass, I put on a set of headphones and I listen to podcasts. So pretty hard to watch it. So, do look it up. And I will also say one more thing. If you get a chance, I would love for any of you all listening now or later to go over to YouTube and like or subscribe to my page there. It's a really good thing to happen. I'm not obviously this YouTube influencer, if you will, but there are certainly benefits to raising your subscriptions and getting people to like it. You start to get noticed more and more, and so I'd appreciate it if you do that. So listen, it's not going to be a different topic. All of my topics are around the concept of personal or professional development. Certainly, the last few have been more along the lines of personal, more. Listen, they're all personal. If you are doing something, even in the professional environment, and you're trying to improve yourself, I consider that, of course, personal development. But many of the things that we've talked about have been more about sort of life in general. And this one, this particular live stream will certainly have that flair to it as well. But there's also another component to it that we will drill a little bit more into the professional life. So we're going to be talking about, communications, how to have conversations, how to build relationships. And again, I'm really, really looking forward to our guest and hearing what she has to say. She's an absolute expert in communication. And and I'll tell you the thing about it. In the course of my career, as many of you know, I spent 20 years in the Air Force, and the vast majority of my work was in human relations education. So it always came down to communication, how people communicated, whether we were talking about ideas of diversity and inclusion or talking about team building or leadership. It seems like throughout the course of my career in the soft skills industry and even in the personal development industry, so many things would almost would come down to, you know, and you'd hear this all the time. Well, I guess it was just a breakdown in communication, and that's kind of that's kind of a sort of a throwaway line anymore for folks. It's kind of an out, but it is true. The other thing that I will say that makes this topic very near and dear to my heart is I grew up as an Army brat, spent 19 years, as an Army brat, moving around the world. I lived in so many different cultures. And I'm not talking about just abroad. I'm also talking about, I've lived in all four corners of the United States and in the middle. And it became fairly natural for me. I learned later on as an adult to be able to communicate with folks, not because I was such a great communicator, but when you move around a lot, you just grow up learning that you have to figure out the culture, if you will, even if it's a culture within the United States, or even if it's another military base that you're going to, a new group of kids. It was this constant thing of starting over again and learning how to get into a community, get into a group of, find a circle of friends and this, that's, that, and the other. And then the other thing that happened later on in my life after I started my career is I spent 3 years at the U.S. Embassy in Israel. And this is where you started to realize just how critical communication is. I'm talking about interpersonal communication. My wife and I, Jane, who's also a veteran, and by the way, I just want to make a shout out to all the veterans out there. Happy Veterans Day is coming up, and I just thank you all for your service. And I recognize, of course, I'm a veteran too, but I will tell you, I have a special place in my heart for the war fighters, for people that, that were really in the hard fight. So, thank you for your service. But having said that, you know, living in Israel in the diplomatic community, you would attend a function and there could be people from 20 different countries there. And you talk about nerve wracking. You talk about, trying to figure out, okay, how do I turn here and I'm speaking to an Israeli, general, and then I turn over here and somebody from the Egyptian embassy, and then across there from, from the, Venezuelan embassy, whatever the case might be. And wow, did I learn a lot. I learned a lot about one, how to zip it, to listen more. You'd be more successful just listening. And I learned how to be more humble in my communication. Americans abroad are sometimes, it depends where you're at, are kind of known as I don't know if I say arrogant, but just sort of just like in your face sometimes. And when you're in a diplomatic community around others like Germans, Germans are kind of stoic. Not all of them, but they're you don't just it's a different culture, and so you have to adapt your personality and way of communication. So, in any event, so this is a very special topic to me, and what's even more special is my guest. She's an absolute expert in it. I'm going to give you kind of a short intro because she has an interesting life and how she got into the position that she did, that she's in today. And so I'll just, her name is Mandy Goodwin Caporaletti. And I hope I got that right. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but I see her nodding in the green room, giving me the thumbs up. So I guess I did that right. She's been teaching. She's a professor right now at Penn State University. That's no small matter. She's been doing that since 2004, and where she obtained her doctorate in interpersonal communication. That's pretty special right there. She recently, by the way, published a book. It was actually an updated version of a book that's been out a long time. I'd actually heard of it before, and but she updated it and is now a co-author of that book. And it was originally written by Alan Garner, and it's called Conversationally Speaking. And I highly recommend it. We're going to ask her about that in just a minute and tell you where you can go, because I will also say, and we're going to talk to her about this, I get this all the time from people. I work with clients that, they want to know how do I go to like a mixer, a Chamber of Commerce mixer, and talk to people. What do I do? How do I do that? And we're going to ask her about this. It's a very, very, very important skill to learn. So about the book, this is hands down the best book on how to make a conversation, or how to make conversation. If and some say if How to Win Friends and Influence People is sort of a cult classic for social skills in general, then this is a cult classic for making conversation in particular. In the book, she discusses many ways that people can become better communicators. She's actually learned a lot. She says she's learned a lot about herself, improved many aspects of her life since becoming an expert in interpersonal communication skills, specifically assertive in how to assert yourself in communication. So, if you will, please welcome, a big clap in your mind for Dr. Mandy Goodwin Caporaletti. Nice to have you there, Mandy. Thank you so very much for joining me. I'm totally geeked about this conversation. I'm here to learn. And so thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
You're very welcome. I'm so excited to be here as well.
Well, first of all, before we go, how are things going at school right now? I mean, are you in school? Are you doing Zoom? Is it a combination? What's happening with speaking of
Yes.
communication with your students?
Our classes in our department are in person right now and with protocols in place. And every now and then we do take ourselves out of the classroom and do something via Zoom, just so that we're not all on top of each other all of the time. But this past year and a half has certainly been a learning experience.
Yes, that's a good way to say it. There's a lot of different ways you can describe that. So listen,
Yes.
I was reading a little bit more about your bio. You have a wonderful bio, and I'd love for you to just, as I do with a lot of my guests, just tell us who you are. Kind of go back a little bit to the beginning that kind of led you to where you're at today. Who is Mandy?
Yeah. Well, it all started back when I was in high school, and I was convinced that I was going to go into broadcast journalism or radio. Radio
Mm.
was always on in my house. I thought maybe I'd be a DJ. I loved music. So something in that realm.
Wow.
And I go to University of Connecticut my freshman year, and I'm taking these introduction courses to journalism and broadcasting, and I'm not particularly liking them. So a little bit of a, oh my gosh, now what am I going to do?
Wow.
But because of the way the major is set up at University of Connecticut, I also had to take some classes in interpersonal communication, group communication. And when I sat on those classes, that's when I said, oh, this
Wow.
stuff is cool. I like this. And I could really see how those particular skills that I was learning about were ones that could really take me somewhere.
Wow.
And I've never claimed, even after knowing all of these skills, I've never claimed to be a phenomenal communicator, because there's a lot more that goes into it than just knowing the skills.
Yes.
But what I did discover was that there were many aspects of my life, and like you mentioned, being assertive, communicating assertively was one of them, that I really wasn't doing
Mm.
at all, because I didn't know how, or I wasn't doing it very effectively.
Yeah.
And so slowly, as I'm learning about these skills and taking more classes, I'm realizing, gosh, this is really something that I can apply to my own life.
Wow.
And it got me thinking, why are these classes not required for everybody to take?
I hear that all the time. I do. I hear that all the time in corporate America and other places where they talk about, people that come into, let's just say, an engineering field. And they're like, wow, it would have been so helpful if they'd learned a little bit more about like how to communicate, with other people, how to get along, how to resolve conflict. That's very interesting.
Right. And that's funny that you say that, because so many of the job postings out there, right, say that they want somebody with group communication skills or interpersonal communication skills. Yet we're not teaching
Yeah,
students these things, right? We're not teaching people
that's
these
right.
things.
That's right. Very, very interesting.
Yeah. So then I went on to get my master's in interpersonal communication, because I loved it so much. And that's when I also started thinking, okay, well, what am I going to do with this degree? And the thought that because I myself was learning so much and how to be a better communicator, maybe I should teach other people these skills so that they can become better communicators as well.
Yeah.
Took a year off to make sure that this really is what I wanted to do with my life,
Hmm.
and came back to Penn State to get the doctorate, and here we are now.
And so your doctorate's also in interpersonal communication.
Yes.
So, describe to the folks out there, where's the focus? And maybe it's obvious, okay, but I still want to ask the question, where's the focus of interpersonal communication? Say, how is that different than, like corporate communication or mass communication or other sort of the other forms of communication out there? I think it's probably pretty obvious, but I still would like to hear it from you how how this is how the distinction, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Yeah. So there are a few different components that go into what interpersonal communication is, but essentially it's where you are building a relationship with somebody. Now,
Mm.
it's different from when you're checking out at the grocery store and you have the scripted conversation, even if it goes a little bit off script and more about, oh, hey, that's a really nice shirt that you're wearing, right? That's not interpersonal communication, because that instance is going to end once you have paid for your groceries and left, and you didn't really build a connection with that person. So the interpersonal communication is more when you have the opportunity to make a connection with that person or people. It's when you do start learning the more personal information about somebody and become a little bit more invested in that relationship. And you can have an interpersonal relationship with an acquaintance, right? You're invested in that relationship. You might not want to turn that relationship into something more than just being an acquaintance, but you do have an investment in that relationship. You are being personal with that person.
Very interesting. That is a very interesting distinction that you're speaking a little bit more about. again, relationships that you either intend to build more of a relationship with or that you must build a relationship with. So, for instance, there are people in the workplace that you may not particularly want to get to know them personally, but you have to work on the interpersonal skills. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yes.
Or
Yes.
the interpersonal relations? Yeah.
Right. Right. And you can absolutely have a wonderful relationship with somebody at work that you don't really care to know outside of work.
Yeah.
And I would still call that interpersonal because
Yes.
that relationship is important to you, right? That's not
Yes.
the person that you're going to be sharing your deepest, darkest secrets with. That's not the person that you would go to first with good news.
Yes.
But you do still need to learn about that person so that you can be effective with them.
Wow, that's great. And I'm going to ask you about this a little bit later on about boundaries because we kind of chatted a little bit about talking about boundaries and that um, and and of course in listening to you I can absolutely see where, like for instance, as you just mentioned, you might have a relationship at work. And let's say for whatever reason you want to keep it more of a workplace relationship, then you have to draw some boundaries there, right? Because
Yes.
maybe the other person wants to build a deeper relationship. So I want to get back to that, but I don't want to forget to talk about boundaries because I think that's extraordinarily important. I know just from my two daughters, who they're both out of college now, but just their college experience, having roommates, um, the circle of friends that they could get in, that there was often a conversation about boundaries. I mean, not us lecturing them, but them learning about, let's say, even their own roommate, that they
Right.
felt like they needed to create some boundaries, even though you saw them every single day and ran into them. And it's not as easy to do. So I'd like to ask you about the book, though. The book's
Mhm.
fascinating. I've heard about it. It was exciting. Uh, Honestly, was I don't think until after I invited you on the show that I realized that you had co-authored this book and updated it, which was just really geeked me up about it. So, tell the audience a little bit about conversationally speaking. It's a fascinating conversation, fascinating topic, and so just tell us a little bit about it.
Right. So it was about 5 years ago now that my department head, Denise Solomon, approached me about a friend of hers, Alan Garner, needed some help updating this book
Mm.
and thought that I might be up for the task of doing it. And so she had given me her copy of the book to look over, and I think I read it in 2 days.
Wow. Oh, there's
um,
right. This was when?
about 5 years ago.
Okay, about 5 years ago. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
4 years ago,
Okay.
2017. That'd be 4 years
Wow.
ago. And so so I read it in about 2 days, and I'm furiously taking notes and saying, "Oh yes, this is great. This I love what Alan has said here," or "Oh gosh, he sounds like this old fuddy duddy. What is he even talking about?"
No
Right? Or
kidding.
this reference, I don't even understand this reference. So it was really fun to go through it and see, how much of what's in the book is still very much applicable, which by the way, all of it is, and then just turning it into something that's a little bit more contemporary, updating the examples, including a larger variety of examples. One of my favorite things about conversationally speaking is that it really is for not just for people who think, gosh, I could really do a better job at communicating, but honestly, anybody would benefit from reading the book because there's so many things in there that we sort of take for granted. We think we do them really well, but I think if you were to read conversationally speaking, you would see that, oh, hey, maybe I'm not
Very
doing that as well
interesting.
as I thought I could.
Yeah, so I'd like to know maybe a couple of those things that we take for granted, but I also want to hear a little bit more about, what, because as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, I mean, interpersonal communication or conversational and conversation, if it's, good 10 years ago, when was the original book written? Show the book if you don't mind, Francisco, real quick, put it up on the screen there. Yeah, conversationally speaking. So, Very nice. So, yeah, I mean, what is there to update on a book like that? When was it originally written?
Gosh, 40 years ago, I think, was
Wow.
when the first edition came out. Yeah.
Okay.
And then it had most recently been updated about 20 years ago, I think, 20 or 25
Okay.
years ago. So it had been a
Okay.
while.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like I said, the good news is that the strategies for improving your communication haven't changed that much, right? The
Okay.
context in which we're meeting people these days has certainly changed, but those strategies can still work. And the
Give me one strategy, maybe, that you would be referring to.
right, so I think one of the biggest reasons that somebody would want to read Conversationally Speaking is, well, how do I start a conversation? Right? Maybe
Mm.
I've tried to start conversations in the past and they don't really go anywhere, or I'm at a party
Mm.
and I want to talk to people, but I'm just not sure what to talk about. For some people, it seems like that comes so easily, and maybe it doesn't. They just know how to start a conversation and they've practiced doing it, right? So, one of the easiest things to do is to look for free information. So that's, is
Mm.
there, something on their shirt that you could talk about?
Oh, wow.
Um, being a faculty member at Penn State, there is a huge, huge, huge network of Penn State alumni. Anywhere I go, I see somebody wearing a Penn State shirt, a Penn State hat,
Sure.
right? And so that is a very easy invitation to go up to that person and say, "Oh, Penn State, I teach there. Did you go there? Do you have a son or daughter who goes there?" And I don't need to know anything else about this person, but by using that free information, I can very easily strike up a conversation.
Very interesting. And that's the same, for me. I wouldn't say that I'm always looking for it, but I certainly always have my antennas up if I'm out. Let's just say I went to a Chamber of Commerce event and networking, comes to mind here. I'm always on the lookout for the veteran because there's an instant bond. Once I find out they're a military veteran, and frankly, it doesn't matter which service they're from, it just opens up a broad conversation that within just a few minutes you can create a bond. This is the sort of thing you're talking about.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. And so you don't have to worry about talking about the weather.
Mm.
Right? You automatically have something a little bit more interesting to talk about. And chances are that topic lends itself to other topics more easily
Yes.
than the weather would. As soon as you're done talking about the weather, you're done talking about the weather,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
But if
Yeah.
you make a connection with somebody based on that free information, chances are when that part of the conversation is over, you can more easily move on to a new topic.
Very interesting. So then, Mandy, what would you say in your way of thinking, has changed over the 40 or the 20 years since it was written before in terms of, conversation or interpersonal communication? What are some of the things that have changed in your mind?
Well, obviously, our use of social media and just
Mm.
electronic devices in
Yeah.
general to communicate with each other.
Hmm.
And I would argue that there's the, the benefits of those types of communication in some ways outweigh the not so good things about that type
Yeah.
of
I'd
communication.
actually agree with you on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, for a lot of people, being able to talk freely about themselves without that fear of judgment
Yeah.
because they can do it online is wonderful, right? Those people
Yes.
are able to express themselves in ways that they never felt comfortable doing before. And so
Yes.
that's really great for them. But like I mentioned, some of the strategies for being an effective communicator still work in these online platforms, right? So you can still use that free information to strike up a conversation. You can
Hmm.
make sure that you are asking open-ended questions of people, right? That hasn't changed regardless of the platform you're on. Open-ended question meaning it's not something that they can answer with a simple yes or no.
Yes.
When you ask an open-ended question, the person gives a more elaborate response, which then again is more likely to lead to an actual conversation as opposed to a dead end. I answered your question.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Boy, that's good. So rather than saying, do you like something, which might just bring up a yes or no answer, you might ask, how do you feel about something, right?
Right.
That opens up the conversation because it's inviting them to express their thoughts or opinions about it.
Yep. Even the statement, tell me about whatever it is,
Mm,
because you're inviting them to give an actual response as opposed to just a short answer.
yes. Wow. So, okay. What was the other thing I was going to ask you about? Speaking of, I wanted to ask you not about only updating. Oh, I guess it was about the updating thing. So what would you say are maybe some of the keys, the foundations um, to conversations or interpersonal communication? What are just some of the sort of the real foundations that you would argue that people need to have in place for
Mm.
interpersonal communication?
That's a really great question. A genuine interest
Wow,
certainly goes a long way,
I didn't
right?
see that one coming, but yes, that's you know,
Right. Even in a well-established relationship, if your partner is telling you about the mundane things that they did at work, if you don't show a genuine interest in that, eventually they're going to notice and they're not going to want to talk to you about their day at work, which then could lead to not wanting to talk to you about other things.
I can hear a
Right.
student though asking the following: "Well, what if I'm not really interested?"
Right.
Then what? I mean, and maybe it's your spouse.
Right. And that's what happens. I mean, that happens, right?
Yeah, it does. Well, what do
That
you
happens.
do?
Well, to some extent you do still want to
Yeah.
be pleasant with that person and let that person share what it is that they want to share. But it is then also important to make sure that you are finding things to talk about that are interesting to both of you. And it's more than just talking too, right? Doing things that are interesting to both of you. And there's compromise there as well too, right? So I might not 100% enjoy doing an activity that my husband loves to do, but I'm going
Yeah.
to do it because it's a way for us to bond, to do something together. But the expectation is he's then going to do an activity that I really love that he might not love as much. And
Yes.
because you're doing it for your partner, the part of it that you don't love so much doesn't feel all that
Yeah.
important at that point.
No, that's really good stuff. And what I'm thinking here as I'm listening to you is thinking about the idea that you know being interested in someone enough to have a conversation with them. There's that, but there's also the notion of what's even deeper than that. So, for instance, with my wife or friends, yeah, they may talk about things that I'm not particularly interested in, but there's another level of foundation there, and that is that I care about them. You see,
Right.
in the case of my wife, I love her. And so where I may not particularly be that interested in a subject that she brings up, I'm going to put some attention to it for other reasons, like, you know, she's interested in it. It's
Right.
not all about me, right? I mean,
Right.
that's another foundation, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It takes two to tango,
Takes
right?
two to tango. Yeah.
It takes two to tango. And this is actually one of my favorite things that I tell students is anytime that there's a misunderstanding in a relationship, you are just as at fault as the other person. And
Mm.
sometimes like, wait, what?
What?
No, this is their fault. They're the ones that didn't make any sense or, remembered wrong. No, you are just as responsible for that misunderstanding. And when you stop to really explain why, they start to get it, right? And
Mm.
so
How do
whether
you make
it's
that argument to them? That,
well,
because,
yeah,
yeah, I mean,
it,
people do think it's always the other person that's wrong.
right. We break down the process of communication, which we don't really have time to do here today, but
Mhm.
there's a lot of variables involved, and there's a lot of things that are sort of happening behind the scenes. And what I tell students is that at any moment in that communication that's happening, there's an opportunity for a misunderstanding to happen. And it might be because you are making assumptions that the other person knows what you're talking about. It
Mm.
might be because you are basing your meaning of something on past experiences that you have had that your partner has not had. And
Mm.
so the meaning of what you're trying to convey might seem perfectly clear to you, but because your partner doesn't have those same past experiences, it's going to have a very different meaning for them.
Mm.
So when you kind of start to break it down like that, they realize, oh, okay, I can see why I can't just always assume that I'm right and they're wrong. And the one of the I don't want to say easy because it's not necessarily
You,
easy,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah,
when you recognize that both of you are at fault,
yeah.
then you can start to work towards eliminating those misunderstandings. And that just involves patience, taking the time
Mm.
to have that back and forth to ensure that you do understand what the other person means. Sometimes that's paraphrasing. Um, it really is just kind of checking in with each other, right?
Yeah, man, that's good stuff right there.
Yeah.
And obviously, and I don't know how much you, it would be interesting to know how much you, in your work, you get into, for instance, emotional intelligence, or maybe more simply put, how people manage their emotions, because
Hmm.
obviously, I've read some research. It's been a while, but the gist of what it is that the more emotional you are, the less you think. And when you enter into a conversation or a situation, you're overly emotional about it. You say a lot of things perhaps that you wouldn't say. And when the emotion comes down, I would say good people go, wow, I can't believe I said that, you know. So then if you're engaged in these kinds of conversations that you're talking about where there's maybe conflict involved, then how in the moment does a person manage those sorts of things to get past this idea that I really believe you're at fault here. And that's a fair assumption for some, but how do
Hmm.
they start to enter into a conversation like that where they wholly believe that if they have any role, it's very little in causing the conflict?
Yeah, that's another really great question.
You know,
And actually, it made me think of there's a chapter in Conversationally Speaking about how to handle criticism.
mm,
And so I'm sort of thinking, right, in a way that's if my partner is not taking responsibility for any of our misunderstanding,
yeah,
some of the strategies that you would use to handle criticism can come into play here as well.
very
And
interesting.
so one of those strategies is stating the truth.
Mm,
So, if my partner is saying something like, you said you were going to do this and then you didn't.
mm,
If that is in fact the true, if that is in fact true, then I should say, you're right. I did say that I would do such a thing and I didn't do it.
very interesting.
And what that can do is it can kind of bring the emotions back down because you're not being defensive.
Right.
Because when those defenses get into play, that's when things can really get out of hand. So by acknowledging the truth, you are validating the other person's perception of
Mm,
the event, right? Yes, I agree.
yeah.
I did say I would do that and I didn't. But then that can also help move the conversation forward and hopefully to some point of
Yeah.
resolution.
Boy, that's huge. Well, I think what you just said there about moving the conversation forward, because we're not, because even as I think about it, I'm not asking about someone. If it's somebody that you don't care about, okay, you don't care about them. But if it's somebody that's important to you for one reason or another, and let's take it back. Let's take it into the workplace.
Hmm.
So maybe you don't particularly care about that person, but you have to work with them.
Right. So you need
And
to maintain a good working
exactly,
relationship.
a
Hmm.
decent working relationship. And so, you can either, so then you're engaged in a conversation, you're in a bit of a conflict where you believe the other person really is more at fault for it. And let's say that it might even be true. But part of what I hear you saying is that when you start to engage in the conversation, you do have to, I guess you could almost call it, extend some olive branches of some sort, which might be admitting, you know, yeah, you're right. And that again, as you're saying, it continues the conversation, right? And you want to continue it as long as you're talking, some good can come out of it.
Right. 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 And like you do kind of want to keep things level, right? Because if one
Yeah.
person is constantly feeling attacked or feeling like they have to
Yes.
defend themselves, that's not level. But if you
Yes.
can reach more of that even ground, then
Yes.
you're more likely to produce results that are going to fix the problem.
Yes. And you have to care enough, even if you don't care that much about the person, you have to care enough about the relationship and maybe even the workplace, the greater good,
Right.
that you are doing those things that like you're saying, you know, maybe helping the person not be so far on the defensive, because if they are, they're just obviously going to keep defending themselves. As long as they're
Right.
defending themselves, they're firing back probably, or they're
Right.
deflecting or whatever it is. And you're suggesting to perhaps by lending, an olive branch or admitting to, then that maybe they would reciprocate in that way.
Right. Right. And people don't like to admit
Right.
that the other person is right.
That's right.
But
That's true.
if even if there's just a small way in which you can acknowledge that the other person is right, a lot of times that's enough to really bring it down and
Yeah.
and make the conversation more manageable.
I just always think that if you can bring two reasonable people together, they can work things out. It's just when all it takes is one not to be reasonable, and it becomes such a difficult conversation, relationship to navigate through. So let me ask you about boundaries then.
Yeah.
You know, talk to me about boundaries, and maybe we'll just kick it off with this scenario that you have a coworker who's very difficult to get along with. You have the desire to, if it's not only for your own mental health and peace of mind during work, maybe you're even a supervisor and realize that that you have some responsibility to keep some level of peace there, but you have a person, might be another supervisor, might be an employee, whatever, that's just wholly difficult to get along with. How do you shape boundaries in those sorts of circumstances? It's almost flies against what we're talking about here, but you got to set some boundaries up to maintain the peace, I guess is what I'm saying.
Right. Right. And actually, back to your question, how has the book been updated?
Oh,
Well,
interesting.
we added a section on boundaries in the newer version of Conversationally Speaking.
Oh,
So,
nice.
yes, the first thing that's so important is recognizing who owns the problem.
Mm,
Because when you're establishing a boundary, if you're presenting it as the other person's problem,
mm,
then they're not going to be very receptive to it.
mm.
But if you express it as your own problem, then you can start to make progress, right? So I have a problem with whatever the behavior is.
I see. Even if it's their problem, or you kind of think of it that way, you're still, I guess, taking this is sort of the I messages, right?
Right, right. Because when it's your needs that are not being met,
I see. Very good.
right? So in that way, you are the one with the problem. Because
Mm,
the minute we start to say, you are the problem, we get that defensive
yes.
communication coming back into play, right? So recognizing that you are the one that has a need that needs to be met is really important, because if you can't even start there, then chances are you're not going to establish a boundary that is going to be very effective.
So it shouldn't be, I need you to get your act together. That's not really what you're talking about, right? That's not
Right,
meeting that need.
right. It's, I have a problem because I'm not getting the
Yeah.
type of work that I need, or the quality of work that I need from
Very
you.
interesting. I like that.
Yeah. It's also really important to be clear about what the boundary is
Mm.
and state consequences, because
Mm.
anybody who has children
Mhm.
knows that if there are no stated consequences, it's really hard to get the child to do anything, because so what if I do it? Nothing's going to happen, right? So same thing with boundary. If somebody doesn't know what the consequences are if I violate that boundary, then they're not going to respect the boundary.
Mm.
And in the workplace, you oftentimes have the advantage of policies that are already in place. And so it might just be reminding somebody of those policies, or
Mm.
using an existing policy in a new situation, right? So that's kind of an advantage of being in the workplace, is those
Yeah.
policies might already be there. You just need to see how they apply to that particular situation. And so if that boundary is violated because
Yeah.
this policy is already in place, these are the consequences.
And those might be
And
boundary. Oh, go ahead, please, please, please.
oh, I
Go
would
ahead.
say, and the consequences,
Yeah.
it might just be that it outside of the workplace, right? If you violate these consequences, or if you violate the boundary, the consequences are, I'm going to leave because I'm going to need some space. I'm going to need some time away from
I
you.
see.
In the workplace, that might not fly, right?
Yeah.
But again, that's why if there are some policies already in place, how can you adopt those to this particular situation? Another thing that can help other people understand why those boundaries are important is if you express how the violation of the boundary makes you feel,
Mm. Oh, interesting. Yeah.
because
So if
now
somebody's
it's
speaking
more
disrespectful to you,
right.
the boundary is, you, I mean, I'm just speaking plain language now, though. Somebody's speaking in a disrespectful way, and let's say does it repeatedly, you're suggesting that there's a boundary. I'm your supervisor, or this is a professional environment. You can't talk to me like that. I mean,
Right.
I'm again just sort of spelling it out. And in now what you're talking about is that, so you're describing the boundary that, listen, our policy or one of our values is speaking respectful to other people.
Right.
And so now you're talking about the consequence maybe of something like that if they
Right.
do
Right.
violate it.
Right. Right. And then to again take that a step further, right? If the person who is feeling that the boundary is being violated says, when you engage in this behavior, it really makes me feel disrespected, or it
Mm.
really makes me feel like you don't, care about the company or the values that our company stands for, or, you know, it should make you feel some way, because otherwise you wouldn't want to be establishing a boundary or reinforcing a boundary. So recognize what that feeling is and express that to the other person, because now it feels a little bit more real, right? It's not just, okay, here's a policy that's in the company handbook.
Right.
It's a policy, but it's also,
Personal.
real
Yeah.
people involved in
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love what you're saying there, because even as I'm listening to you, I can sense, and it's going back to what you said earlier about expressing your need. You in all those things that you just said, you never said you're doing this. You always referred to how it was making you feel. And I think that makes it different, doesn't it, Mandy? That you're not being accusatory. You're saying, hey, this is how it's making me feel. Now, if you've
Right.
got a psychopath in front of you, then they're not going to care. But if it's a decent person, they will accept that you're not pointing them out, calling them out so much as you're saying, here's how it's making me feel, right? So it gives them
Right.
some options.
Right. Right. And I think that's a really neat thing about boundaries is
Mm.
if if you do it right, right? If you establish the
Mm-hmm.
boundary and provide the consequences, if you do it in the right way, it really does minimize the other person or people feeling like they have done something wrong, right?
Very
And,
interesting.
they might be more apt to respect those boundaries because of that.
Yeah. Even if they don't respect it at the moment that you're telling them, it's possible that they will go, and that might just because of the, as my daughter likes to say, sometimes people get butt hurt, but you give them a moment, they walk away and they think about it, so they
Right.
have a bruised ego because you confronted them.
Hmm.
But later on, they may not even come back and confess, but they may just respect the boundary.
Right. Right.
Interesting. What else about boundaries? This is good stuff here. Very useful, I think.
It is. I think one of my favorite things, a great example of boundaries and how you and I were talking about this the other day.
Hmm.
You might not realize that you need to set boundaries until you're confronted with a situation. And so it's a
Yeah.
good skill to know how to do, even if you feel like, oh, everybody that I'm in a good relationship respects my boundaries or whatever the case may be. My neighbor, I had new neighbors move in a few years ago, and the neighbor on the other side of them would freely walk onto their property and into their house.
Oh no. Uh-oh.
And
Yeah, you wouldn't want to
when,
do that around Tennessee.
well,
I'm just saying.
and they were
Wow.
my new neighbors were just,
Dumbfounded, I guess, right?
how, who does this? This
Who
is not
does
right.
this?
This is not normal. This is our home and you don't even
Wow.
know us.
That's
But he
crazy,
would
man.
freely just walk in. And so they, right off the bat said, this is our house. This is our property.
Like you had to say that.
Right. But at the same time, they want to be making
Mm,
sure that, they're new to the neighborhood. They don't want
yeah.
to rustle any feathers. They're going to be stuck, living next to this
Yes.
person for who knows how
Yes.
long.
No, that's right. That's right.
So they were very clear in that, this is our house. This is our property. We don't feel comfortable with people that we don't know very well coming onto our property or into our house. So they made it
Wow.
about
Yes.
them.
Yes.
And, they also, in doing so, in talking with him, got a little bit of perspective from him as well. And well, he basically had free reign of the property when the old owners lived there. He could come and go as he pleased.
Wow.
And so he eventually recognized that, okay, you're right. You are different people, and I can't engage in those same behaviors that I used to. But they had and it happened over the course of several days, but very civilized. Uh, they weren't attacking each other
Very good.
conversations, but they had to be firm in the boundaries. And they did set consequences because, in the first couple of instances where they were having this conversation with him, he didn't seem to get it. Right.
Wow.
So it was, we are going to have to call the police if you are on our property.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big consequence.
That's a pretty good one. Yeah. Yeah.
But, without stating that consequence, what was going to stop
Yeah.
him from coming back over?
This is interesting. So, what an interesting, almost mind-blowing example that I get, and so now I'm rolling back to emotional intelligence. I might even be me. I don't know. I'm not sure how I would react, except that I would want to get, at the very least, frustrated. I would find it very hard to have some empathy and try to understand what they were thinking, because my mind would be saying, I mean, come on, dude, you really, I have to tell you that you can't come into my house. And even if they said, well, the people before us, they let us have free reign, I would say, I'm not sure how easily I could accept that. As I would say, really? And you still have not figured out, though, that we're new and maybe we're not the
Right.
same way. So, my point of saying that, though, is that I don't know, maybe I would, I'm not sure. Maybe it depends on the day that I would launch into sort of an offense rather than, to your point, showing a little more emotional intelligence, being a little bit less reactive for the longer term good, thinking a little bit more strategically about this. Listen, if I, in fact, I might even say, wow, this person's crazy, man. Maybe I don't want to get them too riled up at
Right.
this given point. You don't know. But I appreciate what you're saying there, that that's good cause for communicating a little bit more rationally and thinking this
Right.
through, right?
Right. And it is. I mean, for a lot of people, it's so easy to let the emotions take control.
Yes,
And it's almost like once those emotions are unleashed, it's really hard to rein them back in
that's
too.
right. And you can do a lot of damage between, just given the words that you say. Wow, that's quite an example. So now if we move this back into the workplace, and I want to ask about this, it does seem obviously very important as you are very well articulating this idea of setting boundaries and maybe even expressing to a person what the boundaries are and and your feelings about them stepping into the boundaries. But what if it's with people, for instance, that are they it's almost like no they lead with such an ego and they have such and they're so lack careless about how they deal with other people that if you even spoke to them about boundaries, that would cause some drama in and of itself.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is that might you sometimes have to deal with a person setting boundaries, but not really telling them that you're setting boundaries because then that becomes an issue in and of itself. I don't know if I'm expressing that very well, but I
Hmm.
just think some people are so temperamental that if you mention boundaries, they kind of lose it right there, and that's an argument too.
Yeah, that
And so when I
is.
say boundaries, it might be just like limiting the amount of conversation that you have. So you're setting a boundary, but you're not really telling them.
Hmm. Hmm. I mean, I could see where there's some value in that for sure,
Yeah.
right? And that I would say, that's kind of one of those situations where, because of your previous interactions with this person, you might have a gut feeling that if I were to
Yeah.
be explicit about what my boundary is, it's not going to go over well. Um, but so that could just be,
Very
then I
subtle,
would
right?
say you would have to be very conscious about maintaining that
Yeah.
unspoken boundary,
Yeah.
being very consistent about it, because I would hope then, if the boundary is we're only going to chit chat for however amount of
Yes.
time, right? Then in your internal clock, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, our chit chat time is over. You have to be consistent in stopping the chit chat when the time is up. And that after that behavior is repeated and repeated and repeated, then the other person might start to notice and respect that boundary, even though it was never
Mm.
spoken about.
Yeah. Yeah. That's tricky because I'm just thinking through scenarios that and even if you start to, like, for instance, if you're having a difficult time with a person, let's just say at work, you have to be around them, could even be a neighbor, I suppose, and you just put that boundary in place hard and fast, meaning you stop talking to them. You see, that begins to that again, depending on the person, but I've seen people like this that they'll come to you, well, how come you're not talking to me anymore?
Yeah.
And so I would be almost inclined to say, oh man, just been busy, rather than saying, hey, I just don't want to talk to you anymore. You see, it's very subtle and it's not even completely honest. But
Right.
when you're looking at it from a more strategic standpoint, you say to myself, well, okay, if the person says, why aren't you talking to me anymore? And I now launch back into, well, it's because of this and this and this and this. You know, you've created more of conflict. It's a really odd situation rather than maybe kind of gradually just not talking to them anymore. It's kind of like a friend that you want to eventually distance from. You don't just
Yep.
say, "Hey, I'm done with you," because maybe their personality style is that they might even seek revenge rather than
Right.
just very slowly let the relationship fade away. Sometimes that has to happen.
Right. Well, I wonder if this might be an instance where learning to be assertive would come into play, right?
That's a good point.
Right.
Yeah.
And which a couple of chapters in Conversationally Speaking about how to effectively assert yourself. And what I'm seeing here is that similar to setting boundaries, if you're very clear in what your needs are,
Mm.
and it's a strategy called broken record for a reason, right?
Oh,
And
tell
you
me
just
about that.
consistently repeat your
Mm.
stance.
I see.
And of course, this is not going to work in every single situation, but
Sure.
eventually that person will start to take what you're saying seriously,
Very
right? At
good.
first, they might just kind of, no, we'll just, oh, no, no, let's keep chatting, or, whatever might push it. But if you are consistent and use the same wording,
Interesting.
which is important as well. So, literally, a broken record, you are saying the same thing again and again and again, and keeping your calm, which the longer you have to do this, the harder that becomes. But
Wow.
if you're able to do that, then eventually that person will hopefully get the message.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Oh, that's a good one. The broken record, you call it the broken record strategy, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Very interesting. Well, listen, man, this went by really fast. We've
It
only got a
did.
few minutes here. Wow. I have a million more questions, but listen, I do want to, show that someone from Germany chimed in. In fact, I'm going to just put it right up on the screen. Can you drop it on the screen there? It's from PJ. He says, "Good information. I used to teach interpersonal communication. I didn't know that, PJ. And but you're a great communicator, so I guess I'm not surprised. And it's a subject that doesn't get enough attention. I don't even know that there's many people out there that know there are people like you that are experts in interpersonal communication."
I would agree with that.
Yeah, yeah, very, very interesting. So listen, I want to just maybe ask if there's anyone out there that has a question for you. If they could just ask a question, maybe just pop it up in the comment section. And in the meantime, if people are thinking about questions, and we don't get a lot of questions, so don't be offended if nobody does. But I would love to maybe, you know, ask where can people get in touch with you? How can they find your book? Where can they find your book? The book is fascinating, conversationally speaking. And would you mind also just sharing about the book, maybe a few of the chapters that are in there that might intrigue people and make them want to go look the book up?
Yeah, absolutely. The book can be found on Amazon. Surprising, I
Yeah.
know.
Put it back up there real quick if you don't mind, Francisco, just for a couple of seconds. But keep talking.
Yeah, so Amazon is going to be your best place to get it. But I would have to say, probably my favorite chapters in the book
Yeah.
is listening so that other people will talk. So, not monopolizing the conversation
Mm.
when you are trying to get to know somebody, being able to recognize the balance between, talking about yourself, but also learning about the other person.
Yeah.
I had mentioned the handling criticism chapter in the book, which I think is important too, because a lot of
Yeah.
people don't know how to do that, don't know how to effectively respond when they're on the receiving end of criticism. So that's a great one. Honestly, anybody who I had mentioned this from the start, great book for anybody who feels like, gosh, I'm not very good at it and I want to be better at communicating. Absolutely a book for you.
Mm.
But also a book for people who, what, I got a good handle on things, but
Mm-hmm.
I would like to be better.
Very good. I
Conversationally
love that.
Speaking has, the first set of chapters is more on the how do you actually start a conversation, how do you um, become friends with somebody, right? How do you make a new
Mm.
friend? But the later half of the chapters really do go into more of the things that everybody can improve upon, that everybody deals with on a regular basis. Requesting changes in your relationships, like we mentioned, stating those boundaries. If you do get anxious in certain situations, so some people don't have much anxiety at all. Other people get anxious in new situations. Other people
Yeah.
get anxious when it's small groups. Some people get anxious when it's big groups.
Mm,
If there's any of those scenarios where you feel a little bit anxious, there's a chapter in there about
that's
that.
terrific.
So we really do cover quite a few bases in the book.
Wow, that is really fantastic. Congratulations. I mean, really, that's quite an accomplishment to be published and to update a book that's been around. And again, I'd heard of it before, so
Right.
the
Really unique
title is
opportunity
certainly,
for me.
yeah.
So
And I
very
think it's
grateful to
also,
Alan Garner for that.
I bet, I mean, I just can't imagine that you, as a a PhD in interpersonal communication, somebody saying, "Hey, wonder if you'd be interested in this." Yeah, nah, No, I mean, it's fabulous to be able to do that. And so, where can people find you? I don't know if you have a social media presence, place that they can find you, or if they just should go to Penn State to look for you if they have questions or want to engage with you a little bit more about this topic.
Can certainly check me out at Penn State, and I'm pretty easy to find there. But on, I do have social media. uh, Facebook, I'm just Mandy Goodwin Caporaletti.
Okay.
So
And we'll put
I'm
all of those in the
more
show
than,
notes so people can see those things. Yeah,
yeah,
it's certainly
more
a link
than
to
happy
Amazon.
to reach out to anybody via Facebook. Um,
That's
that would
fantastic.
probably be the best way to get in touch with me.
That's fantastic. I did want to. I mentioned it early on, but I did want to ask again about that. It reached it got a pretty good rating there on that site. What was the site again that it was rated number 4, and then
Oh,
I think number 1 in its category too, or something like this.
yes. What was that?
I'll put it in the I'll put it in the show notes too. I just can't think of it. It was
Yeah.
some type of a social site.
The 35 best social skills books, number 4 on the list of 35 best social skills books for adults, socialpronow.com.
Wow, Social Pro Down. That's pretty great. That's a great. And I think also it read that it was number 1 in its category. I don't know if it was in that on that
Yes.
site or
Yes,
okay.
same site, number 1 book
Wow.
in the subcategory
And
making conversation. So, thank you.
congratulations for all of that.
Yeah.
So listen, so there's no questions, and again, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time. And it's really, it's such a unique field that you're in. I'm so happy that I stumbled across you and that you were kind enough to accept my invitation to grow yourself. And it was a great conversation. So Mandy, thank you very, very, very much. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. And
Okay.
I hope that somebody out there
I guarantee
picked
it.
up on something today that they can start improving some aspect of their relationship.
I think there's no doubt about it. So I look forward to staying in touch with you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, I appreciate it. So, listen, what a great conversation. And, you know, I know from my work in soft skills, in coaching, that the topic of communication is, I'm not even sure that there's a day that goes by that whether I'm working with an organization or a client or when I think some of you all know that I'm also a trained and certified mediator, and I do a little bit of mediation, each month just, to keep my chops up. And, and interpersonal communication, I just don't know if there's a day that goes by where I don't, hear some demand for it, some challenge with it, be it from a leader who is trying to figure out how to not just deal with maybe the people that work more directly with them, but how to build communication and and relationships with the people that they lead in their organization. So you can think of this as interpersonal communication one-on-one, or you can talk about collectively, how do you become a better communicator. And so if you have those questions, reach out to Mandy. And again, she's an expert, and certainly check out her book. So Listen, we got a lot more coming up. In future shows, there's some really interesting guests. I'm not going to spoil it right now, but just stay here on Facebook. Look for us on Facebook or LinkedIn or YouTube. And again, I want to encourage you all to go to YouTube. This feels a little salesy. I'm not a salesy kind of person, but go to YouTube. Now, how's this for interpersonal community? Go to YouTube and click that subscribe button. Okay, there you go. You have it. Now that's about as mean as I get. So thank you, everybody. God bless. Talk to you soon.